Alrighty, howdy. So. Is that visible?
Condition.
Okay. I don't know. I just trust these markers so much. Like so much of my gaslit life consists in these markers. So we'll change it to. What's a condition? So let's give an example of that. How would we use condition in a sentence like it's a requirement?
Water is a requirement to live.
Well, that's the word requirement, but we're looking for the word condition. So how about we talk about it, say like, but you had the right idea, right? Same format, just plug in. So like kind of we talked about the cell phones last time, right? A condition of me drinking this coffee, there being coffee beans, right? So that's just one example. There's other things condition can mean though, right? What are other things condition can mean?
State of being.
Okay, so that's in the, we can use that one in a sentence. Someone do it.
The condition of the economy.
Yeah. Condition of the economy, just how it is, right? Are there other uses of the word condition? What about if I condition you to do something? Pavlov and the dogs. Oh yeah, that's definitely like so. And how like so let's talk about that for a minute. What's involved in conditioning here? What are we doing to it?
We're treating it.
Yeah, so that's a good word for it, right? We're treating it. Or in the case of the dogs, what is conditioning?
Training.
Yeah. Now it might surprise you to know that etymologically speaking, and if you haven't figured that out yet, we're going to do like half of this course is etymology, right? So you thought you were going to learn ethics. We're just doing philology here. The origin of the word condition is to this part ends with, and this part, although it is weird because of the T, really means talking or speaking. So originally a condition was an agreement, right? Or rather, not so much an agreement necessarily, although you do tend to agree upon them. But another thing in the sense of requirement would be like a stipulation, right?
Like terms and conditions.
Yeah, like terms and conditions. That's exactly that, right? The thing that none of us read. So in that sense, we can see how all of these are kind of like, this one's sort of the weirdest one, the state of being, but with the stipulation, the requirement, you can also think of it a little easier if you think instead of condition, you put precondition, right? That helps you remember what condition really means. If you have to precondition it to do something, right? So we want to keep all these meanings in mind, not because every instance of condition means the same thing in all the senses, but rather just that, remember that this we're diving into philosophical anthropology. I don't want to write philosophical every time I have to because I have bad handwriting and weak wrists. Let's just call that philosophical anthropology, right? And the traditional question or subject matter of philosophical anthropology is the whole question, what is man, right? Or better yet, sometimes let's just capitalize the M, right? Make it fancy, right? What is man? And you can imagine Rodin's thinker, you know, that statue, like just contemplating that. What is man? However, another way of wording that is that we're interested in human nature, but Arendt steers us away from thinking or talking about human nature and instead steers us towards thinking about humans in terms of their conditions. Both the conditions in terms of what's required or kind of presupposed in us being a thing. And also just in the state of like, how did we get to be the way that we are, right? How did the human condition get conditioned to be that way, right? That's kind of what we're asking. And there are different reasons why that Bible turn out to be at least sometimes answerable, as opposed to the question of human nature. Why is the question of human nature so difficult, according to Arendt in this section? Peter?
It would take a God to define it,
And why would it take a God to define human nature?
because it is putting the like absolute qualities into a single person.
What do you mean a single person? While Eli is looking for it, why else might the issue or question or problem of human nature be difficult? Or why is it that it seems like only a God would be able to tell us about it? Yeah.
She talks about how we can kind of determine the nature of other things, but we're not like self-aware enough to really like look at our own nature. It's like jumping over a shadow.
Right. Yeah, no, that's the metaphor she uses, right? And I don't know if it's necessarily just related to our awareness, right? As though the real issue is we just aren't aware enough. It has something more to do with that whole like, why would jumping over your shadow be impossible? Yeah, it follows like, well, that interesting, right? Our metaphoric language about the shadow makes it look like it does something, but what are shadows?
Byproduct,
They're byproducts of what?
light hitting.
Light hitting you, and so you have a shadow, right? But not in like in sense of something extra. You make the shadow, right? And so trying to jump, like might be easy in the sense that we talk about having a shadow to think that you could, for instance, lose your shadow, like Peter Pan, right? But that's not how that really works, right? It just is something that comes along with us. Now, instead of casting a shadow, what if instead of casting shadows, we said, we humans name stuff, right? What kind of stuff do we name? That's really broad, but run with it for a few seconds.
Animals, like types of animals. So you have a dog, a turtle, a cat, an elephant.
Yeah, we do that taxonomy thing, right? Or where it's like, oh, cool, we build the whole tree of life and all of a sudden we have games and all that kind of stuff. So, right, because there's that story early in the Bible, like we're looking for traces of how humans have thought of themselves for a really long time. And so you could do worse than to look in some of our oldest literature, including like the Judeo-Christian Bible. And in that book, in Genesis, there's that story where Adam names all the animals, right? And what's interesting though, is that he doesn't name himself. He doesn't, interestingly, we might diverge for this a bit. He doesn't even name the woman until significantly down the line, right? I don't know if you guys ever noticed how odd or funny that is. You're just like, what did they call each other before that, right? But so that humans have long had this whole thing where we name things. Right, so to define something, if you look at this part here, like the fin, the ends, is to set limits, right? That's another way of saying delimit something, to set the boundaries, right? So defining something really ultimately comes down to setting its parameters or its limits. And when those are stable enough, you slap a label on it, which you could also call a name, and then we feel satisfied. But since we do that activity, doing it to ourselves would be a little meta, right? That's why it would be like jumping over your shadow, because it would be like it would be like naming things like, you're a cat, you're a dog, you're a turtle, and then catching a glimpse of yourself in the mirror, being like, what are you, right? So there are supposed to be two senses that Arendt talks about of the question of human nature. One, the so-called philosophical, and the other, the psychological one. What are those about?
Who am I and the what am I?
Yeah, so the philosophical question, okay, we'd start with the psychological question. We can ask, who am I? This would, of course, correspond if you weren't focusing on yourself. So it'd just be the question of, who is the human? But then there is the philosophical sense. And if you notice the philosophical sense in this, so this is the psychological sense. Why? Because it's kind of the one we think to ourselves that we have an experience of. And the philosophical version, which you might have noticed is supposed to be more general, is the what am I? Or what is human? Now remember that if definition is what I said it is, and it's setting the limits and you're trying to ask about the what, that would mean that you would ideally enumerate all of the limits, all of the things that about the human, right? And all of the traditionally essential things, right? So the question of a what in philosophy is often the quest for a nature or what we call an essence, right? And traditionally those have been what we wanted when we were looking about this question. But now when we look at these two questions, what does Arendt say about, well, these two questions and why they seem, sort of the relationship they have and why they seem unanswerable? Well, does answering one give you the answer to the other? Kind of. In what
Well,
way?
yeah, if you know what you are, then you can figure out who you are. And if you know who you are, that can help you start learning what you are.
So there may be a little bit of like relationship between them two. I think though, let me see, what does she say? So this is on 11, right? The perplexity is that the modes of human cognition are applicable to things with quote natural qualities, including ourselves, right? To the limited extent that we are specimens of the most highly developed species of organic life, fail us when we raise the question, and who are we, right? Have you all ever noticed that anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists and biologists are notoriously worthless as guides to life? Like you could take it, I mean, those are cool things, right? I studied anthropology and psychology. I'm really just a nerd, right? But all of those things, what you learn is, okay, 200,000 years ago, our particular lineage of large craniumed beings kind of broke off from the others and has been doing this thing. Even more recently, we came by this bit called agriculture and all this other stuff. All of that's cool, but who am I and what should I do with my life? Those don't really hook up, right? So while we can study those things in that scientific sense, knowing the what does not necessarily answer the who. Now it's true enough that, actually I think she says in a footnote, the simple answer, if you just want to be kind of blunt about it, is who am I? A human. Whatever that means, right? And obviously you can see my flippant gesturing is kind of related to hers, which is like, yeah, whatever that is, like, but that's the placeholder, right? You're a human, but that does not get us very far. So, and at the same time, what else does she say about, what did she say about, well, what she calls, we can call this the question, you see? The question of human nature, that's one we could do, but it's also historically related to, or she claims it's related to, that other question about the nature of God, right, or the divine. So what did you say about these two questions? Sorry.
The quote that I got was, the fact that attempts to define the nature of man leads so easily into an idea which definitely strikes us as superhuman and therefore is identified with the divine may cast suspicion on the very concept of human nature. So human nature is more of an ideological concept, and the only way that we can really reach it is by explaining it with something that's outside of what we set as our realm or our limit.
Yeah, so the word ideological is a good one, right? So in case you all didn't know, at least in this old Greek Platonic language, the word for our word idea, right, renders the Greek word for form, which is Plato was really into. But right, so, and this is also, right, the question of what is man. In this case, you can also say that kind of the issue with the question is that man, as capital M, man, is an idea. It's a concept, right? It's not the same thing as the real organisms that we are. So one, you can ask questions about the nature of man as an idea, or you don't necessarily think it's idea, but you wind up asking questions about an idea or a concept, kind of an abstraction. Whereas traditionally, whenever people have sought the question of human nature, it's almost invariably leads to questions about the nature of God, right? Why might that be? A couple of reasons, but why might it be that when we try to answer one question in one way, we wind up in a neighborhood of questions about the other thing? Even unexpectedly, right? Like this isn't like, we're not talking about people who've explicitly tried to answer this religiously, but why might those questions be related?
Goes back to that whole meta thing. Like we're trying to set our own limits, and so we're kind of forcing something else outside of us to set those limits and make that human nature definition.
Okay, so that's definitely, but it's the nature, it seems to be in the nature of definition itself that what we're trying to do kind of relates us back to this other question. Does anyone recall that saying about human beings supposedly being made in the image of God? One of the things that idea expresses, if you remove it from the idea of it historically meaning that humans literally look like God, which nobody has ever really thought, it's really a question about saying, it's as if, sorry. What the idea of humans being made in the image of God or the gods expresses is the thought that we can't help but when we think about our own qualities to have to kind of idealize and abstract them. But when you do that enough, you wind up with a sort of superhuman model, right? So you don't have to know this, but the historical figure who sort of figured this out was Feuerbach, right? But at the same time, the fact that these questions seem related, does that mean that they're both kind of bullshit? That they're just like, okay, well, we thought we were going to do anthropology, it turns out we're doing theology, you should just scrap it. Is that what everyone thinks about it?
No, it kind of, she said it gives credence to. No, because she said that it casts suspicion upon the very concept of human nature. So kind of.
Well, it might cast suspicion on the project, but does the fact that for those who talk that way, does the fact that the question of human nature and divine nature are related, does that, for instance, show that there's obviously not a God?
No.
Okay, so that's what what she does say about both of these things, that they're both what we could call, are you out of your mind? Theological questions, right? Not that they're both about God, but what makes them theological is that if you're going to ask these kinds of questions, they only make sense within the context of an already kind of given answer, right? Which is what she calls like in the context of a revealed answer. So when philosophers do stuff, they try, at least they're supposed to try, not to take nearly as much for granted, right? We talked about taking things for granted, like our experience and things like that. A lot of times philosophy tries to get at the very root of things when we're not taking all of the things for granted. But by the time you're asking about the nature of God, you've probably taken quite many things for granted, right? To make sense of it. Long ago, that wasn't necessarily the case, but nowadays it is. So part of her address is to say, look, if we treat this in terms of nature, this is going to be the kind of question which I can't do anything with philosophically, because what you think about the ultimate nature of the human and its origins and or relationship to the nature of God are things which theologians deal with, right? You read the Bible for that. You get your answers and they come about through different ways. This project, in as much as we're doing philosophical anthropology, can't depend on that. So we make them move to conditions, right? It's not that these are unanswerable or unimportant. They're just not the focus of this discipline, right? So that's why we move to conditions. And now that we've talked a little bit about that, let's move on to what some of the actual conditions that we talk about, right? So what is the first, what are the fundamental activities that this book is about? There are three. One of them's action, yeah.
Work. Labor.
Okay. So these are fundamental activities. And they correspond to different conditions. So what are the conditions? And then we'll talk about what does it mean that those things are the conditions of those things, right? So what's the human condition of labor? Ready? And how about work?
Worldliness.
And how about action? All right. Did all of that make sense to anyone, or is this kind of just like, I need help with this? Does anyone want to show, like, try to talk about what? So this is the activity, right? And these are the conditions, or the condition. What does it mean to say that life itself, is the underlying condition of labor?
For life to happen, like labor is the kind of, it's the instrumental thing. It's the necessary thing that you have to do to live. It's being sustainable. She said it was, labor is the activity which corresponds to the biological process of the human body. So by laboring, you're growing, you're progressing, you're doing more, you're surviving.
Yeah, so definitely like the paragraph you're in. We might just first start asking like, what is life for her? How is she using the word life? Because we all, I mean, there's some pretty obvious senses, but as you guys have probably figured out, when she uses words, she often uses them really specifically. So what, just from what you just read, Eli, can we say about life in the way Arendt is talking about it?
Biological, like the actual physical, not the philosophical term, just biological living.
And what are the things she does? Biological, what else? What's biological, the adjective modifying?
Spontaneous growth. Metabolism.
Alrighty, and there's a P word in there, I think. Biological.
Oh, process.
Yeah, so it's going to be really, really important for Arendt that we think of life as this, in the sense that she's using it as a process. Now that process involves, as we were just saying, right, our metabolism, decay is part of it, growth. And it's all also, importantly, in a certain sense, spontaneous, right? Because spontaneous isn't that necessarily important, but it's really important that life is a process that includes those things, right? So, why might it be important that life is a process in relation to labor?
Because you work to keep it moving.
Yeah, keep it moving, keep it going, right? Or since we want to keep the word separate, we might say you have to labor to keep it going, right? So the life in labor, let's do it this way. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. This happens to me a good deal, where at a certain point in the month, you're looking at things, namely your bank account, and you might wonder to yourself, where did all my money go? Anybody had this experience? Right? This sort of like, it's time for the budgeting. Where did my money go? And although I always say that with great like confusion, as though I have no idea until of course I check the receipts, right? Where did the money go, by the way? This isn't like a request for confessions of specific purchases, but where does our money usually go?
Buying things.
Okay, buying things, yeah?
I mean, first and foremost, kind of just like the basic necessities like food, housing.
Okay, so food, housing, and again, that's another thing which she brings up, which they're related. This whole life process is related to our, what you'll call vital necessities, right? Now, necessity in general is going to be really important for for this book, but in general, we'll find out why later. But those are these vital necessities. Yeah, what do those involve? So housing, food, okay. Let's assume that, okay, so I'm wondering where my money went. Let's assume that I've spent it on food, right? I go to Chipotle after this. Where did that go? Where did the Chipotle go?
Your body.
Nutrition.
Okay, I ate it. Okay, nutrition, cool. What happened after that?
It left.
Okay, so it left by one of two everlasting methods, perhaps at the same time, and wound up in the toilet, right? So that's the answer to that question. Where did my money go? The toilet.
Yeah.
What about drinks on Northgate? Where did that money go?
Hopefully the toilet.
Hopefully.
Somewhere.
I don't know. We have to ask my buddies for that.
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Okay. You see, this is important. This is how these things happen, though, right? Of course, we don't remember, but we can, if we pay attention enough, find out. And we're, of course, like the Chipotle and like the Taco Bell, and even like the really healthy meal prep stuff. Where did it all go?
Toilet.
The toilet. The toilet is where my money went most of the time, unfortunately. Now, is there any way to prevent that? Could I just decide out of sheer spite for life to stop pooping?
No.
I mean,
Wouldn't
actually,
last very long.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah, it depends on the limits you set.
And-
Like how long.
it depends on the limits, it depends on cooperation, the technology, but like, so even though it sounds kind of morbid to say that the vast majority of your money will usually probably wind up in the toilet, that's not an avoidable thing. That's just part of what it is to live. What if I also decide I'm just like, I'm not gonna eat, dang it. I will probably also not get very far with that direction, right? So now at the same time, so the fact that all of that relates to my biological process. And the same thing is true of anything and everything which I consume. Because being a living organism is being a consuming organism. And all of those things that we ate and put in our body were consumptibles, right? And the process that turned them from glorious, beautiful food into whatever you look at when you turn around after you're done in the toilet was consumption, right? Now, and all of that was a necessary part of the fact that life is a biological process, which involves me being the kind of thing that poops and pees, right? However, hopefully, right? Hopefully not all of my money winds up in the toilet, right? If it's food, if it's a consumptible, generally it does. And often, if it's not the toilet exactly, it may very well still be the garbage bin, right? But not all of my money, or not all of the things that I own and interact with wind up immediately in the toilet or the garbage bin. What about your cell phone? Where did that money go? Where is it now?
In the past.
Hopefully your pocket, right? If not, you need to like ding it or something, like go searching, right? Like some of the stuff that we have, and again, it probably wasn't a good idea to start this off and talking about money, but, and again, not all of my money winds up in the toilet immediately. Some of it is on me, right? On my person or on amongst my effects, right? Or in my room or in my driveway. And so how are all those things different from the stuff that becomes poo-poo?
That last one, we made them.
Well, one, we made them, right?
They're not immediately trash.
Okay, they're not immediately trashed, so they're a little bit more durable, maybe. Or perhaps we're just hoarders and don't know when to get rid of things. But, so it's a little bit more durable. We made it, right, usually. Now, of course, we made the poo-poo, but not the same way, right?
Intentional.
Like there is no such thing as like fecal craftsmanship, right? Good.
Those things came to us through labor and they're not necessities necessarily.
Oh, actually, it's a little bit flipped, right? So everything, so what we're doing right now is just working through these connections, right? So life being the underlying condition, which on one hand we could mean both just the state of things, right? How we are. We're the kind of creatures that have to sustain ourselves somehow. And that involves attending to our vital necessities by eating and then excreting, right? Now it's work in Arendt's definition, which corresponds, again, remember we talked last time, I think, about the artificialness of the world, the
Yeah,
fact that we've
worldliness,
made
right.
stuff. So worldliness, which corresponds to that whole artifice of the world, right, is the fact that on top of being the kinds of creatures which, like all other creatures, have to eat and excrete and all of that, we also love junk. right? But that's not a bad thing necessarily, right? Because if it weren't for our love of junk, we would just be naked, shaved apes who pooped and ate all the time, right? So our stuff, our junk, so to speak, what I'm calling pejoratively junk, is really our entire world, right? Have you ever noticed how, like, I think this is true, I think this is probably still true, right? So if you've moved around like a lot, like, you know, here in like College Station, like from like maybe apartments to a house or something, particularly if you're in a house, obviously apartments have an interest in cleaning this junk up. But do any of you live in sort of like a house situation where your house just has a bunch of crap that nobody strictly owns because it just came with the stuff? Because that's what we do, right? We humans accumulate the junk. And then right as you're moving on to your life after graduation, you get to turn around to your roommate and be like, you keep all that, right? I threw away boxes of junk when my roommate escaped into like normal life. And it's just like, but there's so many things, right? And at the same time, if all of that stuff gets moved instantly, like if you, I mean, like for instance, God forbid, if you go home and you're robbed blind and all your stuff is gone, that's not a good feeling, right? And it's not just because we're acquisitive and materialistic. It's because your whole world consists of all the stuff you have. The clothes, the floor, the car, the phone, all of it is, in Arendt's terms, what makes our world, right? Because the earth is not the same thing as the world, which is not the same thing as a planet. So the distinctions are important. And so that is where some of the stuff goes, right? If it's not just going to be fed and consumed by my life process, ideally we want stuff to outlast us, right? So that life is the condition for labor. One, because literally you need to be alive labor at all, but because labor only makes sense as a process if you understand that it corresponds to and is trying to support this other process called life, right? Now, what we can suspect, however, is that life as a process is kind of unending, right? Because you will have to eat several times a day, every day, for the rest of your life, until you finally don't. And you will have to poop and pee with some regularity, some of us more regularly than others, every day for the rest of your life until you don't. And what happens when you don't anymore?
Not a lot.
Well, you're not alive, right? So the process is over, but as long as the process is going on, it's unending, right? But similarly, what that means is that our labor is never done, right? Work has some end, right? When is the work over?
When you get over things, 5.
That's really funny. The work, so artifice, another word for like the things or objects instead of junk would be artifacts, right? Objects that we made. And strictly speaking, we'll return to this later down the thought, so we're going to talk about this in other sessions. But the work is technically done when you're done making the object. You don't strictly need a cell phone, just like you don't strictly need a car. But if you're going to make the car or the cell phone, that process at least has an end in sight, right? A craftsman, as opposed to a laborer in Arendt's sense, can finally one day step back and be like, yeah, that's done, right? Because work isn't necessarily an unending process. Now, as you've probably noticed, the fact that we are tempted to use them interchangeably, and the fact that we probably experience a lot of our work as this unending process, shows us the extent to which we've confused and or equate laboring with work. Yeah, Traverse?
Yeah, so where do we put like housing in this? Because it's something that we made and it's usually gonna outlast us. It's not immediately trash. We're not gonna buy a house, get it for a day, like I'm done with this.
Yeah, that's part of our world.
That's what I'm doing.
Right. And that's the house is probably the better example than the cell phone in the car, right? Because the point is that the world we've been building, literally working on, is supposed to outlast us, right? I mean, would any of you like to inherit a house from your parents or perhaps other ancestors? I mean, that may not be realistic economically anymore, right? But isn't that like, is it the normal course of events whereby after like people pass away, it's just like, okay, well, now let's just get rid of the house. Ideal. I mean, again, circumstances now demoralizing circumstances have made that very much often a thing. But if we think like Little House on the Prairie style, isn't it supposed to be the case that you build your nice big like rural estate and that 4 or 5 generations, someone with your name plus a number stapled to it gets to live in it? And what explains that, again, not just as an inquisitive, let's just plant ourselves somewhere and like, is the fact that we need a world, as the creatures we are, the particularly vulnerable shaved apes that we seem to be, if we just think of ourselves in terms of life and labor, need to build a world around us that's going to outlast us, or at least outlast me, right? It is a little bit unrealistic to hope and expect that, for instance, military walk will be the same 50 years, 60, 100 years down the road. But hopefully it doesn't go to crap the minute I leave, right? Otherwise, I mean, you know, something about engineers getting C's, but ideally the world outlasts us, right? And that's what it's supposed to do. That is what it makes possible. That's what work makes possible. Work makes possible stuff that lasts, right? Now, how does that factor into this other group? Because this seems by comparison. We can explain these against each other, but action and plurality are the weird one. So what is plurality?
Man. Not, or yeah, men. Men, not man.
Yeah. So again, like I said, man, the idea of the human, is suspiciously usually singular. For instance, isn't it really odd, now that given all that we know about the way things work, that most creation narratives always just kind of naively assume it's like, and then God or the gods made one person, maybe 2. That gets complicated, right? We begrudgingly admit that the entire other half of the species is a thing. And then from all that, somehow, billions and billions of people have come. It's just kind of mind-boggling, right? So if you start with the idea of the human, you often start with this singular idea, kind of being like, yeah, what is the human? And then you can wind up idealizing it to such an extent that either it's not really realistic or it's downright terrifying, right? If we start with a different reality, namely this whole fact that there's always been others, plurality names that phenomenon, right? There's always been more than one, right? Since time immemorial, even though we would really like at various points to pretend that it was once much, much, much simpler, the human condition of plurality means that one, our condition just is one of there always having been a lot of us, and at the same time, a precondition and possibility for this other thing, right? So what did you say about plurality in action? A lot, yeah. So that this we can say, what are some of the things she says about?
Plurality is the political life. It's how we interact with each other instead of, because work and labor is a very individual process. Like you're the one who eats and you sustain yourself.
Mhm.
Work, you are either making the artifacts and you're keeping them, or you're the one with the artifacts. But action and plurality is all about being and coexisting or not coexisting with other men.
Right. So as you all will find out and see, whenever Arendt talks about action, she's always talking about what she thinks of and what the Greeks would have thought of as politics. Not what we think of politics, but action for her is always preeminently political, right? So if you want to do, first of all, if you want to do anything involving more than one person, although you might not literally think about it that way, you're engaged in political activity, right? So let's return really quickly to right. So in the prologue on page 3 at the bottom, she says, however, even apart from these last and yet uncertain consequences, the situation created by the sciences is of great political significance. Wherever the relevance of speech is at stake, matters become political by definition. For speech is what makes man a political being. Right. So although that might have been obvious at the time, it's also going to be the case that Arendt definitely thinks that speech is political by definition, which also means that one of the conditions for speech, for meaningful language, is the fact that we have more than one person to talk to. if there were only one single being in the universe, such a being could have no need to say anything. It could and it's not even clear that such a being would have a need to think anything, because thinking is derived ultimately from our speaking capacities. Don't at me, we can talk about it later. But speech is, and hence language and communication is always going to be a kind of action, which is always going to depend on the fact that there's more than one person to talk to. And so anytime you speak to somebody meaningfully, although you may not realize it, especially if you want to get them to do something, you're engaged in political activity. Pass the salt. Why? What is my saying pass the salt supposed to do? Like if I was just like a robot or something, or if I was omnipotent or had telekinesis or something, would you like the fact that I'm trying to get you to do something and that I have to use words already shows that communication is a very complicated collaborative endeavor. So plurality, but how to, again, what does that all have to do with the fact that there's more than one of us? Because there's not just more than one of us. There's plenty of us, but what else about us makes it kind of interesting?
It says that we're not all the same, we're all different, even though we're all human.
Right. And so there are far more ants than there will ever be of us. That's not interesting, right? What's interesting is that you all have rich life trajectories and stories and warm fuzzies deep down inside of which I know nothing. And that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. There's an emotion called sonder, right? In which, and this may happen to you, right? Do you ever just like people watch the airport or something? Like you're just sort of seeing, and not, again, none of this is a concession that you are creepy. But do you ever people watch for realsies? Like even if you are like in traffic and you happen to like catch the person next to you, the car next to you jamming out, and it's just like, oh, that's interesting. Like, and you're sort of like looking in, and at the same time, you're gonna drive off when your light turns green and you're never gonna see them again. And who knows what on earth they were going on about. And similarly, you know, you see like the family bustling in the airport, and you know, like it's those little interactions, right? Oh no, the baby dropped its binky. Are they gonna remember it? Oh, it's okay, the mom turned around, they found it, okay. So-and-so dropped their hat. Oh no, like we are always, it's as though we were always gazing in through a window onto this big sort of world in which everyone's doing their own thing. And you don't have to be a part of it. Most of the time you're not, but sometimes you get to, and that's cool. But if you ever feel overwhelmed by that realization that you're never going to meet even a small fraction of the many billions of people on this planet, and yet they all have a life of their own, they all have their own values, and they all sort of are aiming for happiness. And if all that ever gets a little bit too much, you're experiencing sonder, right? So the importance of plurality, as she says, and it's even a great quote, is that, right. Plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live, right? That was on page 8. All of these, really quickly, because we're always, as ever, running out of time, but all of these conditions, these 3 which are conditions for this, have even more general conditions underlying them. There are 2. What are they? Vida activa is what all these refer to. So vida activa is not one of the conditions. It's just what we're calling all of this, right? But there are 2 other conditions which are of broad general application.
Mortality and mortality?
Yeah. So the fact that we're born and the fact that we die, right? How is natality connected to plurality?
That's more people being added.
Yeah. So another thing you may eventually come to process is that in the same way that there have always been others, there are always more, right? This whole educational endeavor is predicated upon the fact that part of why I can hope to have some measure of job security, which is fake, by the way, is that there will always be a class of 20-some-year-olds in need of education, right? Because they're just always being born. It's just ridiculous. Like we can abstractly think about things like saying every so many seconds someone's being born, every so many seconds someone's dying. But if you were to really, again, cognitive like process and like experientially process that, it's a lot. It's like again watching things just multiply in like indefinitely, right? So natality is the condition of the fact that we're born, or another connection to natality is the ability to begin something new. Mortality, of course, is related to the fact that we will die. And not just, as we'll see, that we will die in the sense of our organismal process is one day going to stop and run out, but that on top of this organismal process that has been going, on top of, as it were, all of the poo-poo, is, is the individual life story, right? In the end of the day, your poo-poo is probably not distinguishable from mine, at least appreciatively, but our life stories are different, right? And make us who we are. And so the fact that that story ends at the same time that, or around the same time that the biological process ends, is what we mean by mortality. Because of course, we've already established that life is a precondition for other things, and we know that it ends like for other conditions that we die. But mortality and natality are also general human conditions that make sense of all these other things, right? So yes, these are 5 of the human conditions which go into making the human condition. And these are the activities that they make possible, and that also they make sense of, because these things only make sense against each other or like through each other. What else can we say in the last 2 minutes?
Natality was the central category of politics.
Yeah, so what it is also like, so politics, we're always going to be contrasting what we might call political thought, and then what you'll often call metaphysical thought, which for her is really just a euphemism for philosophical thought. Why, really quickly, and I'll just sort of cut to it if nobody wants to try, but why is natality so central to the political for her?
Because I think like the birth of like new humans is also the birth of new potential ideas and new actions.
Yeah, the fact that there's always this constant influx of newcomers who are all different is the wellspring of where all this action can come from. Also, we need to take action to account for these people who are going to be born, right? We can't just let the world go to crap. I mean, we can, but we shouldn't just let the world go to crap, because there are generations of beings waiting to be born, so to speak. Now, and also as a result, this also connects to action, to the fact that plurality, we have to talk and get it done. Mortality corresponds to metaphysical or philosophical thought, as you guys will discover by Friday, because even though we're all share these things and have them in common, we all experience death alone. So, on that note,
Jeez, okay.
We all experience that alone. Have a great day.
Have a great day, kids.